Good Monday morning, everyone. I am so excited that you guys have joined us today for our very special guest, to meet our very special guest. This is Cheryl Miller. She is the author of, you have the Language of Shalom, and then most recently, Continuum of Transformation. Now, some of you might know Cheryl Miller, one as just a community philanthropist, but for almost 2 decades, you were the executive director of the Perpetual Help Home, and I am so honored to have you here. We've got a lot to talk about today.
Okay.
But I wanted to let everyone know, one of the things that I want to make sure that we get to is that you have a training called Transformative Dialogue. It's a little bit further ahead in July, but I wanted to sort of plant the seed now for people in our community to kind of understand, now that you have a business, Quantum Circles, how this all became a part of the dialogue for not only your business but for the community, and of course in the trainings that you have coming up. Because one of the things right away I just want to say, on your website it says, one of your biggest transformation is that you started as a single mother on welfare,
right?
And now you own this business, Quantum Circles. So it was a big introduction. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
So Cheryl, let's talk a little bit about you.
Well, like you said, gosh, it's been almost 30 years. But I was a single mom. I found out that I was pregnant and I was alone, and it ended up, the circumstances, I ended up losing my job and I had nowhere to go.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I was kind of trying to figure out what to do, and then all of a sudden my sister called and said, hey, I just feel like maybe you should come stay with us. And so I did. At the time I was living in Fort Worth and moved to Yoakum, Texas, and moved in with my sister. And I had basically nothing. And so I was on, back then it was called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and now it's called TANF, but I was on welfare. And because of that, I had limited access to medical care, and I had access to excellent medical care because my brother-in-law was a physician. But we just tried to save money on things, and so I didn't find out until I was in labor that I was actually having twins, and that they were 2.5 months premature. And so I had 2 children that were actually born into the welfare system, and the best thing for me was that my sister said, if you come here, we can help you get back on your feet, but you're never going to be able to support your kids if you don't do something different, if you don't go back to school. And so I did.
Were you formally educated prior to that?
I had gone to college and dropped out. And so I had some college hours, but I had never done well. And so my sister had said, it really said, if you come here, you need to get back in school so you can have some way to support your kids. And so I did. I went back to school, and a year and a half, I went to school continually, summer and everything. And almost 2 years after the twins were born, I graduated with a bachelor's degree and became a public school teacher for 7 years. And I actually met my husband, Leslie, probably maybe 3 weeks after the twins were born, and we started dating not long after that. And
how's that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, here's my new girlfriend and her 2 babies,
and her twins.
Exactly. But I graduated on a Friday, and we got married the very following day on a Saturday. And so, and we've been together over 30 years now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so it was. It was just, back then I really wasn't thinking about transformation. I was just surviving. It was just doing the very next thing to try to get to someplace, and then I taught school for several years, and then kind of accidentally stumbled into the job at Perpetual Help Home. And within the first 2 weeks that I was there, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I was born to do. This is what my life has accumulated to, because I just saw myself in the women. And I thought, oh, wow, they can do this. If I can do it, anybody can do it.
Right.
And so that kind of became the foundation of everything that we did at Perpetual Help Home.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the women of Perpetual Help Home. Well, I want to talk about the women of Perpetual Help Home, and I want to talk about you stumbling into this, and then that feeling again of just, this is where I belong.
Yeah.
So tell me about, for those who don't know, what Perpetual Help Home was.
It still is. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it still is. It's a housing program for women. And when I started there in 1999, it was a program for women coming out of the county jail.
Right.
Because the lady, Barbara Wilcox, started the organization, and she was working in the county jail, and she would see women come in and try to change their life, but then they'd have to get out and go back to the same environment. And so her thought was, if we created a home where they had somewhere else to go. And so when I started, it was a 7-bedroom house, and we had women that were living there, and then we'd get calls like from the school district because they had a homeless mom, and I felt like, well, I can't say no to a homeless mom just because she hasn't been to jail. And so over the years, it just became a home for women in any kind of crisis situation, homelessness, addiction, coming out of jail or prison. The group that we tended to attract the most when I was there were women with long-term substance abuse. We just seemed to be really successful with that group.
Can I ask you something personal? Because something we've never talked about before, and you can pass, but did you ever have experience with substance abuse?
I did, yeah. Early on.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, it wasn't as extreme as some of the women that I've worked with, but it was enough to know, have some insight into that whole arena. So
because that leads into the next question, which is, you walked in, and in 2 weeks you were like, this is where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, what was that?
Well, because I look at the women and the situations that they're in and see all the chaos, and I thought, I remember that.
Right.
I remember being like that. I remember my life just being crazy out of control and trying to figure out, what do I even do?
Right, where do you start?
Exactly.
And all the double-edged swords, and I'm somebody who's employable, but I don't have a car, and I can't get a car.
Exactly.
Because I don't have money.
And my circumstances, you hear a lot of voices about, you hear things when you're in poverty and when you're in that kind of crisis situation, is that you don't have as much value as everybody else. And after a while, you start believing the lies that maybe I'm not good enough, maybe I'm not that smart, maybe I can't do these things. And then, for me, going back to school and becoming a teacher, I realized, okay, I do have some things to offer. And so when I would look at the women, I could see the same thing in them. It was like, these are some incredible people. Excuse me. And over the years, they've even proven me right more than I ever imagined. I mean, long-term drug addicts we can tend to want to throw them away because that's, they've done it for so long, that's all they ever are. But it's not. They're capable of so much more. And especially people in addiction. It's like people don't realize what good business people drug addicts are. I mean, they get a lot of things. And so if you can just refocus that energy.
Such an incredible thing for you to say.
I mean, if you can just refocus that energy.
Right.
I mean,
repeat that. Most people do not know
that people in addiction are incredible business people.
Because
they're entrepreneurs and they're hustlers and they know how to get things done.
They know how to get things.
They can figure it out. It's like they are singular in what they want, and they do whatever they have to do to be able to get that. And when you can take that mindset and that focus and redirect it into something healthy, it's like they become unstoppable.
Well, and let's talk a little bit too about how you saw that and how you channeled that into creating some really innovative things within the Perpetual, community.
Well, I don't know that I can take too much credit for it, because the women themselves are the ones that have the gifts, and then they're also the ones that have to decide, do I want to take the risk of trying something to be something different?
Okay, but let me say this. Before you got there, was there a program for women whose sole focus was to become entrepreneurs and to start their own businesses?
No.
Okay, so let me just say, because here's the deal, because that model from Perpetual, from Victoria, Texas, that you were as the executive director, spread throughout the country.
Yeah. Well, and it really happened organically.
Sure.
It really did, because like I said, first it was women coming out of jail, and we realized, well, we needed to change that because there's women in crisis all throughout our community. And And as we modified the program over those first 5 or 10 years that I was there, I mean, I really came at it from an elementary teacher's perspective of, okay, we want women to get from point A to point B, but what's the avenue that they're going to take to get there? A teacher knows I've got to give them steps to get from point A to point B. You have to learn things along the way. And so we really refined the program over the years, and it just kind of naturally, organically turned into what it was as the housing program, and it became a good housing program. But then we realized they could do everything right that we've asked them to do, but there were still limitations. They were working, but they weren't making enough money to be able to support themselves independently once they left us. Or if they did, it would just be barely at the poverty line.
And that is a huge issue.
Yeah, and so we thought, well, how can we help them increase their employability? And that's why we started a social enterprise, a training center, and that's where it all just kind of took off. So, and that was the Center for Peace, which is no longer there after the hurricane. That building got pretty much messed up, and so it's no longer there. But the original part of it, where it developed, it just kind of came out of a natural desire to see how can we challenge. And for me personally, it's always been like, okay, what's next? What's the next thing we can do? What's the next thing that I want to do? I love being a part of something new and creative. And so once we hit a certain plateau, we realized the only way we were going to tap into the next thing is if we did it with the women that were coming in, if that makes sense.
Right.
So that's what we did, and we just kind of turned it all over to the women, and what they did with it was phenomenal. And so there's some amazing stories in those 18 years at Perpetual Help Home. There's some amazing women.
Yes, I know a few, and they are amazing.
Yeah.
So in between, you are now the executive director. Tell me about, the Language of Shalom and where that came from in that time frame.
Well,
because that was your earlier book, and that was written in
2011 or 12, something like that. I'm not good with dates, but around that time, I was invited to go to a conference for an organization called CCDA, which is a Christian Community Development Association. And I went to the conference, and I heard one of the founders speaking, Dr. John Perkins, and the things that they were talking about was what we did at Perpetual Help Home. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is our language, this is our people. And their annual conferences have anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 people in them. And so you have all these people gathering together, like-minded, and I was just really fascinated with that. And so at the time, Dr. Perkins, he lives in Jackson, Mississippi. He had opportunities for people to come and do like a weekend retreat there. And so I packed up some of the women from Perpetual Help Home, and we just booked it and went up for the weekend to learn from Dr. Perkins. And we actually ended up going 2 or 3 times, taking several women. And I think it was on the 3rd trip, and he loved the work that he loves the work that we're doing here in Victoria. He still does. And he's actually been here twice to Victoria. He came to visit. And so we were there at one of the retreats with some of the Perpetual Help women, and he leans over to me and he says, "You need to write a book." And I was like, "I'm not writing a book, Dr. Perkins." And he goes, "No, really, you need to write a book." And I'm like, whatever. But he kept using the phrase, we need a new language. We need a new language. We need a new way to talk to each other, because we can't keep using the old language that we've had from the past. Because he was very involved in the civil rights movement, and he's just an amazing man.
Right.
And so when I did finally decide to write the book, the thing that kept echoing in my mind was him saying, we need a new language. And since the book is about peacemaking, that's why I decided to call it the Language of Shalom.
Because shalom means
Peace,
harmony.
harmony, wholeness, welfare, everything combined. It's like when everything is right is what shalom is.
And then tell me about the 7 keys to practical reconciliation. This book that you wrote, The Language of Shalom, is really for who?
It's for people who want to facilitate reconciliation or
define. What is your definition of reconciliation?
Well, that's kind of a hard one.
I know.
It really kind of goes back to making things as right as possible.
Right.
And wherever there's conflict or wherever there's division, is there a way to bring things back to a more normal state. Some things can't be reconciled, but there can be healing. And so, the book came from a lot of the work that I did, because one of the things that people don't know about me, some people know I was at Perpetual Help Home for 18 years, but a lot of people don't know that I've also been a mediator for over 20 years. And both in standard mediation and then restorative justice mediation. And so
give everyone an idea of what restorative
justice is just a different way of looking at crime and harm. And instead of asking, what law was broken and what's the penalty for breaking that law, restorative justice says who's been harmed and what needs to be done to repair that harm.
Right.
And so the program that introduced restorative justice to me was the one I volunteer for.
Sure.
So,
and that means sometimes that you are with the victim, and then you are with the, what would you call the?
In that particular program, it's the offender. It's because it's called Victim Offender Mediation Dialogue. And so
tell me about that. Tell me about being a part of that. Now, so you're at Perpetual Help Home. When did you decide this is something where perhaps my heart is strong enough? Because I'm assuming it takes a very strong person to mediate because of the stories and to be able to help both the offender and the victim.
Well, and that particular program, it is a victim focused. It's completely it's a victim initiated, victim focused program. And I just it was another one of those things that I kind of stumbled into. When I first started working at Perpetual, the executive director that I replaced was supposed to speak on a panel at a restorative justice conference. And since I took her job, they asked me to take her place on that panel. And I was at that conference when I saw the booth for VOMD, which is Victim Offender Mediation Dialogue, and so I started volunteering. Because I remember thinking, for one, I had a background in mediation, so it was fascinating to me that you could do mediation between victims and offenders. But then also, because at the time, Perpetual was working with women coming out of jail, it really appealed to me to be working with people who've been harmed by a crime as well, which is the victims. And so I felt like it would give me a chance to work on both sides of the criminal justice issue that is so prevalent in our communities. So I started volunteering, and I've been doing it for 18 years. I would say that you don't have to necessarily be a strong person to do that. You just have to be a willing person. Because people have said that to me in the past, that I don't know that I could do that, and it's like, well, I don't know that I like doing it either, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it.
No, I understand that.
Yeah,
completely.
and so it is hard, because I mean, a lot of the mediations that I do, most of them have been murder mediation, sexual assaults, DWI, manslaughters, that type of thing. And you can't hear any of those stories without really hearing just pure devastation.
Right.
And so, but then the flip side of it is that through the process, there becomes a sense of understanding, in some situations healing, that's just really profound. And I remember the very first mediation that I did, afterwards, the victim told me that for the past 10 years since the crime, there's been this boulder on her chest slowly crushing the life out of her. And the day after the mediation, she said, and now it's gone. I feel like I can live again and I can breathe again. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that transformation happened in an hour and a half?
Right, years, decades.
Yeah, exactly. And to have an opportunity, to just be able to breathe again, it was like, why wouldn't I want to do that? Why wouldn't I want to be a part of that? People would say the same thing about Perpetual Help Home. It must be hard working with women, in those types of situations, and you must take a strong person. I think, not really, because I end up getting the better end of the deal. There's just one me, and there's 15 women living at the home at any particular time, and as they grow and learn and we become friends, it's like, there's hundreds of women that I love all across, this community and the state, and they love me too. I mean, that's a huge payoff, for very little work. So So it's not as challenging as people think that it is. It's very, very valuable for me.
So why leave it?
Well, I still volunteer.
Right, I figured you were going to say that.
I still volunteer as a mediator. I took a time off, and then I've just gotten back to volunteering again. So I'll do that as long as they let me. I left Perpetual because we had started doing the training, that I do with, back then it was called the Language of Shalom was the name of the training. And it was kind of like, how do we merge what I knew from the mediation field that I was in prior to doing VOMD, how do we take that, and then also the stuff that I was seeing that was creating such transformation in the lives of victims and offenders, and then the stuff that we were doing over at Perpetual, and can we combine all those to see an increase in impact and transformation? And we found you could. And not only did it create more opportunities for transformation, but it happened more dramatically and it happened more rapidly because of the processes. It just speeds things up, and it increases the ability of how much change can happen. And so we were doing training through the Center for Peace at Perpetual Help Home called the Language of Shalom. And then once the hurricane hit and we kind of had to think about what do we want to do next, that's when I realized most of the training was based off my background and my personal experience. And so I thought, if there's ever going to be a time where I want to try to do this on my own, this is probably it. This is a good transition period for me to transition away from the home, because we were doing so much restructuring already.
And you like new.
I
you
do.
like to create new.
I do. Yeah, I really do. And so the idea of doing my own business based on the stuff that I love was just too hard to pass up. And so,
Can we talk about your dream?
Sure.
Can we talk about where quantum circles came from? And
Well, the dream was actually probably about 14 years ago. I had a dream one night, and I heard God in my dream tell me to, Cheryl, remember this word, quantum. And so I was repeating it in my head, and then a little while later in the dream, God said, remember this word, fluid. And so I was repeating that, and a little while later in my dream, I heard him say, remember the word circles. And so when I woke up, I was like, what was that dream? Quantum and fluid and circles. And so I called my niece, who is a physics person. I said, what does quantum mean? And she said, why are you asking, Aunt Cheryl? And so I told her about the dream, and she said, that's really interesting. And so she hung up the phone and called me back about 10 minutes later and said, you're not going to believe this, but there's actually something called quantum fluid circles. It's a part of the quantum physics, and I don't know all this stuff about it, and I don't want to try to explain it. But I do know whenever there's a disturbance where there's quantum fluid circles happening, it becomes unstoppable. It never loses energy, which is a significant phenomenon. And so I thought that's really cool that a disturbance could create something unstoppable.
Right.
And so at the time I was writing the book and getting ready to publish it, and the lady that I was working with, she said, well, it'd be a lot easier if you just start your own publishing company, and then you could directly, self-publish. And so I was like, well, if I have to start my own publishing company, what would I call it? And I was like, well, I had a dream. I'll call it Quantum Circles, because I would like to be able to be a part of something that's unstoppable.
Right.
And so,
wow, that's so powerful.
Yeah. So that's where, that's where it all started. I started the publishing company, and then I published the first book, and now I use that publishing company to publish the printed materials.
Let me take this. This is the Transformative Dialogue.
Yeah, and so
impact, transform, reconcile.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, the idea, it's not limited to reconciliation, because like I said, there's just places where reconciliation is not necessarily the right word or the goal, but making things better, making things right, impacting our communities, transforming, all of those things can happen if we use the right tools.
Let's talk for just a minute. Let's stay on this for just a second, this transformative dialogue, because you have a training coming up July 10th and 11th here in Victoria, Texas.
Right.
Where will that be located?
Right, it's at C3 Victory Church, the church that I go to.
C3 Victory.
Yeah, and
okay, cool.
that's where I've done the last several trainings there.
So who should be interested?
Well, to be honest with you, it just depends. Originally, it was designed for people who are doing community type work. Anybody who's dealing with challenging customers, challenging clients, really helping people. Anybody who's trying to help people make change. That was the original customer.
Because it goes way beyond what I originally thought was, this is for women who have, who are really has some intrinsic motivation for some restorative justice themselves,
Yeah.
to making amends. But this is something completely different, much bigger than the scope of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So this is really for anyone in our community, men and women, that are looking for change,
Right.
that are looking for...
And looking for better tools on how to communicate.
Right.
The whole training is all about tools on how to communicate and how to communicate more effectively. And so once we started doing it, we realized there's a lot of people who need these skills.
Right.
And it comes out of mediation, it comes out of communication. We've trained local business people.
Right.
I had a friend go through the training, and she started sending all of her managers, all of her team leaders to the training, and they're just a local professional business. And so, well, I shouldn't say just, they are. And so we've had nonprofits come through, and they send their staff to the training. So anywhere where there's conflict or you want to be able to communicate better, that's what
Hence
this is
the
for.
dialogue. Where are we in communication, you think?
Oh my gosh. I don't think we do a very good job in communicating. Sometimes we like to think we do a good job, but we are so divisive in our society right now. We have so many polarizing issues that are facing us, and it seems like the gap is getting wider and wider and wider, and people are going further and further to the extremes. And where are the people trying to say, hey, wait a minute, how do we begin to close this gap? How do we begin to have conversations that are civil, that acknowledge, okay, we don't have to agree and we don't have to feel the same way, but can we at least be humane and have civil conversations? And maybe in some places come to a place of understanding and agreement on some of these issues. And that's the big focus of, that's why I call it transformative dialogue, because I really want to see people coming together as opposed to be moving apart, because we're just not doing a very good job, especially on, when you see rants on social media and stuff like that. It's like, it's just pushing us further away from each other.
What are some ways in which, outside of taking the class, what are some suggestions that you have for us to have better, more open communication and dialogue with each other? Let's say on a political spectrum.
Well, one of the things
Because I see that the most.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I would suggest is don't always assume that you know what the other person's thinking. Don't always assume that you know the other person's values. That's a huge mistake that we tend to make. We tend to think, well, those people are blah, 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 and they think this way or they feel that way. And when we do that, we dehumanize the other individual. And so for me, that's just an easy tool. Is just don't assume that you know what the other person's experiences are. Don't assume you know what they're thinking. And the best way to figure out really what's going on with them is to have a conversation with them. The problem is that if we're not careful in how we set those conversations up, especially if there's conflict or really extreme polarization, the conversations can go bad very quickly. And so that's why I do my training, is to give people tools.
Do this. Yes, this is awesome. And then the last book, the Continuum of Transformation. This is a really interesting because it's pocket-sized, and I love that thing. Nothing happens, I just want to read this. Nothing happens until the pain of remaining the same outweighs the pain of change. Arthur Burt.
Yeah.
That's very, very powerful. Tell
Right.
me a little bit about that.
Well, and it came, that little booklet actually came from trying to explain what we were seeing at Perpetual Help Home.
Right.
I have a friend of mine, Robbie Burge. He and I were sitting at lunch one day talking, and we were trying to come up with language of what we were seeing because the change was so phenomenal. And out of that came the idea of that there's kind of phases that we go through in transformation. And if we can kind of name those and look at what happens in transformation, then can we be better at facilitating it? And so that's where that book came from. It's just kind of like giving the language to what change looks like and how we can best join people in that and create spaces for that.
So I want to know in my mind, right away, you are one of our community's, I think, biggest success stories. What advice would you give to a woman who was coming out, let's say right now, out of jail and, entering the home? And where I'm going with that is the dialogue that is created in the head that is probably running constantly, that stops women, I think, from making the change, the leaps.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that I would encourage any woman or any person that wants to be, wants changes, to be around more positive people. Somebody who's going to speak truth to you, and somebody who's going to encourage you, because you don't unhear the lies on your own. Somebody else has to say, you have value. You can do this. I believe in you. And you may not believe it at first, but if I keep saying it to you, and I keep pushing you, and I keep challenging you, and I keep providing opportunities for you, like people did for me, you can do this. You can go back to school. You can make something of yourself. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I can or not, but I'll do this. And before long, you realize, oh, you have that moment where it just like the aha moment and the light comes on. So I just say you have to get connected to people who are for you and not against you.
Where are some ways in which you feel like women can get connected?
Oh, there's all kinds of places, depending on, your circumstances. I mean, you can go to organizations, especially if you need a place to stay, go someplace like Perpetual Help Home. There are a lot of nonprofits who are doing good work in the community. Churches in particular, I would really encourage. If you have a problem with addiction, get connected up to AA or NA, because, anything that's about promoting change and moving people away from destructive behaviors, there's a lot of resources that people have that they could connect to.
And what about community? How are we as community members, how should we respond to and help facilitate, change in
I think
ourselves and our community?
That's one of the things that I love about Victoria is Victoria is a very caring community, and they're very supportive. I mean, I saw that over the 18 years at working at Perpetual, that people want the best for others in this community. I mean, there's always bad people out there, and there's always people trying to hurt others. But for the most part, this community is all about, I feel like, is more about encouraging people to be the best that they can be. And so there's a lot of cheerleaders out there in the community, and there's no way you're going to make change on your own. I didn't do it on my own. I had a whole list of people that worked with me. I had a whole bunch of people that were encouraging me. We can't make transformation on our own. It has to happen in community, which is the premise of that book. I mean, it's mediation, restorative justice, and community. That, we have to have the connection with people to really be able to make the impact. So. And I have that training. You mentioned the training coming in July, but there's also one coming next week, but it's not here locally. But I'm really excited the training that we're doing next week. It's in Louisiana.
I'm excited to hear about that too.
Yeah, and so in fact, the name of that particular training, it's the first one we've ever done. It's called Closing the Gap, and it's specifically designed to teach people how to be facilitators of processes that begin to close that gap where there is extreme polarization, where there is extreme conflict, where there is extreme harm. We're going to actually train people on how to facilitate that dialogue, and that's coming up next week. So,
are there spaces available?
There's
for
still
that?
spaces available.
Okay, let's
for that.
talk about that. Let's talk about the Closing the Gap retreat very quickly. How would and this is a great way to sort of end it, which is, where would we get information for, or how can we order Transformative Dialogue? How can we be more connected to you so that we can look at things like, perhaps, can we go and attend the Closing the Gap, retreat with you? Where do we find you?
Okay, well, I have a website. It's called Quantum Circles Consulting and Training. It's qcconsulting.org. And so you can go to that website, and you can find my books there. Transformative Dialogue, I don't sell the book. That's just a training. That's that book that you were holding is actually the training manual. Closing the Gap is on my website. The Closing the Gap is a very spiritual journey, though, and so the Transformative Dialogue could be for anybody, businesses, people of faith, whatever. But the Closing the Gap thing next week in Louisiana is a spiritual journey. It's like helping people discover, why am I called to be a peacemaker? Why do I feel like I want to be part of bringing people together around challenging issues and challenging conversations. And so it's both learning the tools and then also being on a spiritual journey.
Tell me about this. So tell me, you guys are going to leave Victoria, you're going to go to Louisiana for a couple of days. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, it's at a camp. It's at Camp Bethany. My son actually works there, and so it was like a logical place for me to go anyway. I get to hang out with my baby. And so it's at Camp Bethany. It starts on a Sunday evening, and it goes Sunday evening, starts May 5th, and we go all day Monday, Tuesday, and half a day Wednesday. And it'll be training on facilitation and dialogue and communication, but then I have a friend coming in from Virginia Beach, and he's going to do some guided prayer times and some personal interactions and journeys. So it's going to be a combination of both personal spiritual journey and learning really good tools. So I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited
wonderful.
about it.
I'm so honored to have you here to sit with me and talk about these things.
Thanks
and
for
I'm
having me.
super excited about your new business, about just having the dream, and then 14 years later,
I know. I would
never
never have expected to be here when I had that dream 14 years ago, but I'm loving every minute of it.
Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for coming on Southbridge and being a part of it, and good luck with Quantum Circles.
Thanks.
So I'm like I said, again, I can't wait. I'm just so excited. Thank you guys so much for watching Southbridge Street Live.